everyone, and welcome to the Overtime Leader podcast. I'm your host, Gillian Davis, and founder of Overtime Leader. So in today's episode, my guest is Laurence Honerick. Laurence has a fascinating background, starting in the world of startups, being part of Y Combinator's, I think one of the earliest cohorts, to then navigating startup land to agency land, and then ending up at the head of brand design studio at the BBC. I thought Laurence would be a great guest, one, because we met earlier this year. We've had a chance to work together on some of the Overtime Leader projects, and he's just a phenomenal person. So I thought, what a gem of a person. I'd love to share him with my audience. And we focused the conversation really around strategy. The reason is that, one, it's Laurence's one of his favorite topics to talk about, it's one of my favorite topics to talk about, and one of the most critical things to align on this side of the year. I think strategy can sometimes intimidate us, we make assumptions that it's been done, but it's a key unifier for all areas of the business to align and make sure that we are all moving in the same direction. So strategy isn't one to be underplayed, it isn't one to rush through, but again, not to overthink so that it never happened. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. We cover a lot of ground in just 30 minutes, but I love the gems of wisdom that Laurence was able to share with us. He covers everything from, why he loves strategy so much and how that's really informed his appreciation and leaning into design. We talk a lot about how do you help people join you on that change. So leaning a lot from his experience, navigating massive org transformations. And I think a key and critical component when we think about strategy, we often don't spend enough time thinking about how do we bring people with us and how do we kind of help people let go, especially when, ideas are new and we've got to change. So some really good tidbits of wisdom there. And then lastly, I'm not going to spoil too much, but some words of wisdom from his boatyard days, what he's learned about being on the ocean, how that can help us lead change in a more smooth sailing way. So enjoy the episode and look forward to hearing what you have to say in the comments. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Overtime Leader podcast. Today's guest is Laurence Honerick, and I cannot wait to dig deep into all things strategy, design, and change management. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over the mic. Laurence, why don't you introduce yourself, share a little bit about who you are, and why you love strategy so much.
Sure. Okay. So I am an artist turned startup co-founder, turned Y Combinator alumnus, turned early settler of Silicon Roundabout, turned broadcast designer, turned design strategist, turned design leader, turned sort of management and strategy and operations consultant, which is where you find me now. Latterly, I've been doing a lot of work with Overtime Leader, which has been an absolute delight, and which brings me to this chair. It's nice to be here.
Excellent. Well, it's great to have you. And I thought I'd kick into gear with sharing a little story as to what the conversation that really set up this whole podcast. I mean, I always knew the day I met you, whether we worked together or not, I'm like, this guy is going to be on the podcast because he has a lot of interesting things to say. But at the Overtime Leader Christmas party, we, for those that weren't there, we were in small room, small table, great chat, and I gifted the Overtime Leader question cards to the team. So these question cards are a deck of cards with some safe for work questions to get to know your peers, your friends, family even a little bit better, but would draw out things that don't normally come out in the conversation naturally. And as Laurence was flipping through these cards, he came across this one, which says, I dislike the word strategy because, and to this he said, but I love the word strategy. And that's when I knew that Laurence really needed to be on this podcast and actually kick off the year because strategy does define all. So, Laurence, strategy. Why do you love it so much?
Well, I mean, I think having come from a craft background, you can really see what happens when subjectivity runs rampant in any kind of creative or collaborative process between two or more individuals. I remember in the early days of my career when I was a less mature professional, wishing that you could somehow take all of those personal feelings out of a debate and just know what the right thing to do was, and then find a way to get it done. And I remember, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, I started to hear about strategy. And the more that I heard about it, the more that I understood what it was, it sort of like this magic moment where I realized that's exactly what the thing I was looking for always was. Something, to guide a conversation with a person to find out what your joint priority is and to achieve it without anything that can really get in the way. I think it's like what strategy is fundamentally is the knowledge that what you're doing is the right thing. And more often than you'd probably realize coming to it cold, the knowledge that it's the right thing for the person who you're talking to as well, if you've done it right. Strategy is just kind of like a way of prioritizing the wants and the needs of an individual or an organization, right? And I think that, if you really want to get something worthwhile done, there's nothing that can beat a good strategy to support it. On the other side of that coin, it can be a good self-rationalizing tool. Strategy isn't just the thing that you use to get the thing that you want done by hook or by crook. If you apply strategy honestly, it might be the thing that leads you to discover that the thing that you want is not the right thing and that you need to change your own course. I think if you use strategy responsibly, it's helpful not only to get done the things that you want to do, but to reassure or interrogate sort of your assumptions around what that thing truly is.
Yeah, agree. And I love how you use strategy as that kind of great unifier and bringing everyone together. I think, again, pulling out what you're saying around taking the emotion out of the conversation, because it's not about what I want, maybe, but actually anchoring back to what's best for business or what serves the direction of travel. I think what we've seen in the work at Overtime Leader is strategy sometimes taking a little bit of a backseat. People either not thinking that they are mature enough to need one, or assuming, well, we have a mission and vision, isn't it clear the direction of travel? And I always say this, that strategy statement needs to sit between what we're choosing to do today and my day when I get to work and I'm doing this and I'm not doing that. It's because, yes, it leads me towards the mission and vision, but it's the glue that connects those two, the bridge. And at the end of the day, strategy really is one big assumption, informed assumption, sometimes, one would hope, based on the, resources we have and the knowledge we've made or capabilities. But it's a series of tests.
Yeah. Safe to say. And strategy is something which is challenged over time. It should be. And which, even if it sound, say this year, may not necessarily be the right thing in its exact same form the year after. I mean, industrial landscapes, for instance, can shift, which would force sort of like a reevaluation of a strategy of a particular thing. But at the same time, you need to watch out for sort of like changing your strategy too much too often, because otherwise, what's the point of having a strategy if it's changing every month? Strategy is something which will be the connective tissue between all of your actions today and next week and next month and next year and over the next 5 years to lead you to that outcome where you want to be eventually, right? And I think if it's always sort of just changing costumes, changing clothes, you're not really going to get that kind of cohesion and that kind of consistency, which makes sort of strategy valuable and comprehensible even to yourselves or, very importantly to your audiences or to your users or whomever is consuming your communications, your strategic communications. I think so. It really does need that impact over time, that cadence, in order to mean something. If you think about like what a brand isn't something where you have this experience with a brand, say like an ad or an engagement with a product or something, and all of a sudden you know what the brand is. Brands are built over time. And in order for that brand building to make sense over time, there needs to be a consistent sort of experience of what that thing is over time. And that is, at least in the realm of visual communications, where strategy kind of comes into play.
Yeah, you make me think. I've seen the let's change the strategy every 5 minutes in action. And you create not only like a chaotic organization, but you lose your credibility. And I'm going to add in a third C. As you were talking, it made me think how important leaders who are leading a strategy need to have a lot of conviction. And I do think that's why people dislike strategy, because it's scary. We are saying that we don't know what's going to happen, but this is our best guess or direction of travel. And it can take time for proof points to show up. So stepping out into that unknown with conviction to bring people with you, but also hold tight, hold force. Well, there might not be a lot of signals along the way. Any builds on that, reflections?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. I think that best strategies are sort of honed and refined over time to be increasingly confident. And I think when it comes to the leader who's agreeing on or relying on or reinforcing or interrogating strategy, I think it's like there's the other side of the coin, which is, if you have a strong strategy, it is much easier to make deliberate decisions as opposed to ones which could sort of fluctuate with, the weather outside or kind of like, whoever's panicking about what at a particular moment, which in a business, let's face it, a business of a particular scale, there's always going to be panics, which are trying to push the agenda one direction or the other. For leaders, a solid strategy is a fantastic thing because it's like that compass that helps them navigate that unknown territory of the future where, they may not know, how to get over this particular mountain that's between them and north, but they know they need to go north. They know that their destination is north. So they know that even if they have to take a wiggly route to get there, that's the direction they'll go. They're not going to start saying, let's go east, let's go west. Let's keep on going in that direction because this mountain's going to stop us. It gives them space to kind of pivot, realign, sort of reassess and reinforce their commitment to what is kind of like a long-term vision. Because, businesses, they don't rely on kind of a sequence of short-term visions in order to succeed, do they? It really takes a sense of what this thing is building up to over time.
Mm. Yeah, and I've seen even in my own business, in clients, like whether you're 2 people or 200,000 people, this great unifier of a strategy, that's what is the foundation of an empowered organization that everyone wants, right?
Totally. It keeps everyone from just sort of going off in lots of random different, it's like you could end up in a situation where you have multiple visionaries within a company who each with their strong vision pull the company apart, if they're not kind of aligned and yoked to the same vehicle, which has a defined direction, that visionary thinking can be difficult, can be damaging if it's not aligned with strategy. I mean, you have to be really, really careful to make sure that the great vision that you have is in alignment with the fundamental needs of whatever business you're representing. I've worked in design and projects ancillary to design for the majority of my career. And I at this point failed to see a division between design and strategy. I think that all of the best design that you will ever see in your life is effectively strategy visualized. I'll always remember something that was said by one of the greatest designers I ever met, a guy called Hugo Tim. And someone asked him what he did for a living. And he said, my job is to visualize strategy through craft. And I was like, oh man, like you got to print that on a t-shirt for all the designers of the world. Taking that one step further, one of the greatest designers of all time, in the world ever, a guy called Saul Bass, he pretty much said the same thing. He said, design makes thinking visible, or something along those lines. I might be paraphrasing there. But at the end of the day, what he's really trying to say is this is saying something, and it's saying something specific. It's not an arbitrary or subjective aesthetic statement. It's showing you, in the case of, for instance, an ad communication, what this company wants you to consume or what it wants to drive fame to or how. There should be a really deliberate connection between design. And it doesn't just have to do with ad communications. It could be the design of a logo or the arrangements of a brand hierarchy or a business model. There's all sorts of things that your strategy should be playing into. Essentially, if it's any kind of communication that anyone's going to consume to inform any impression of what your business is or what it aspires to be, it needs to be linked to the fundamental strategy, which has been thought through and ratified by leadership, and which has been, as we said, kind of interrogated and refined over time to become increasingly reliable.
Yeah, and that those comms need to, I think the same level of effort needs to go into the external comms or whatever, how you want your audience to engage, whichever medium, as much as the internal comms.
Absolutely. Like a company needs to know what it is, A company needs to know what it is. Leaders need to be clear on what they stand for and what their vision is. And, and that goes, far beyond design. That goes into all the decision-making practices that, for instance, a leadership group will approach,
And I think this stresses the importance of bringing, one, ensuring if you're a CEO that design creative has a seat at the table. They are not an afterthought, but they are a key part of the process in understanding the context and constraints that the strategy is being built within. I think very often we see, we've done a strategy, please go build some assets to bring it to life. And a lot of in-house or any creative leaders, always say to me, I don't feel like I really understand the business. I'm like, how can you understand the business if you're not in the room? So because they are so interconnected, it's not an offshoot, it's not an afterthought. It should be embedded, that thinking, embedded from the start. And as we were saying earlier, like creatives, visionaries, two people sitting in this virtual room, we get a lot of ideas. And when we don't have that anchoring around, or even like sense check, does great idea, but will it serve this strategy, this goal, this direction? No. I think we can then quickly rationalize, we might be emotional about it, but we can rationalize why that's not for me. But when we're not given that context and we don't have that base, it's ideas on ideas on ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I think, looking back on my career both as a practitioner and as a leader, as a strategist and all those things, it's like the number of ideas that I loved that we just had to say no to because it wasn't in alignment with whatever the strategic need of that communication was. I mean, it's innumerable. I mean, it's a hard thing to do, because especially in an industry like creative, you're there because you want to have great ideas and bring them to life, and you want to love them and nurture them like children and send them out into the world with all the best chances. And I think it's like when you have that kind of like that spark, that moment where you feel like this is right for me, that's a dangerous and seductive moment. Sometimes it's right. It's not like that's always going to be the wrong thing to do. But if it's the thing that you're doing for you instead of the thing that you're doing for the business, I think you do need to take a little step back, see it from the cold, hard light of day, because it's not going to help in the long term in the same way. It's like you might have this totally standalone idea, which is really exciting and fun, but if it's devoid of business strategy, it's just going to be a moment in time. And two things will happen. One, it's not going to address whatever business need was underneath the brief as it initially came to you. It's not going to address that thing. It's going to be doing its own thing that you're excited about. So that need that people were investing time and money and energy and effort and bandwidth into is going to remain unaddressed. And possibly that's going to be something that will only get worse over time. And then the other thing that's going to happen is that there's not going to be the connective tissue between this communication next month and that communication in, let's say, 3 months' time, and the one after that, again, you're trying to build this impression of, for instance, what a brand or what a company is or stands for over time. If it's just like random ideas that are fun moments and kind of explosions, it's kind of frenetic and disconnected, people aren't going to know what to think of this company. Whereas if it's based on this strategy of, we are trying to be perceived as this, and we are trying to accomplish that, and we want people to do the other, right? And those questions are honestly answered in this communication in the same way as they are with that one. It doesn't need to be the same idea or the creative. They just need to be answering the same questions and delivering on the same needs. It could be a completely different expression of the idea, but just so long as those things are being really honestly answered. It's like there'll be a connection between those two and the next 5 and the next 10 and the next 15. And all of a sudden what you have is an understanding built over time that that your business is a reliable and coherent and understandable, comprehensible thing. People can close their eyes and know what your business is, truly, right? Instead of kind of like, oh yeah, they're kind of this thing, and they did that interesting thing in another. I don't really know what they're about, but they're cool, I guess. I'm not sort of, but what are they on? What do they even stand for? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not to be underestimated. And I think as you were talking, it made me think also, if you are leading a series of exciting ideas that may not connect to the strategy, and you're leading your team into, you're getting them all excited and prioritizing things that do not serve the strategy, that image that you painted of like, oh yeah, they're doing all these things, but I don't really know how they connect, is also how the internal brand of your team will be seen as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're doing some fun stuff, but I don't really know what that has to do with this. And creates that big divide and silo, and does no good. Well, then people call folks like us in to do team alignment workshops when really everyone is aligned on where they want to go, but how they get there, no one's talking about it and no one's working together. And my ideas take precedent over the greater strategy.
Yeah, yeah. And it just come back to that idea of, what if you have 3 teams or 5 teams or 6 teams that are all doing their own thing, which they're super excited about, but they're all moving the business in all these different directions, and it's losing its cohesive center of gravity, which keeps all things in orbit. It's becoming increasingly disorganized, and that's not good. That's not good for optics, internal or external, but it's also really bad for like inter-team dynamics, interdivisional dynamics. It makes it more difficult for leadership to kind of to say charge and in this direction, and it creates kind of this culture of differentiation, which is like which makes all communications a lot more difficult.
Yeah. It makes me think of a few years ago, I was talking to a design leader, and they spent the first bit of the conversation talking about how they'd had an executive team offsite, and the founders were pressing, like both engineering focused, but pressing the importance of site reliability. Like, we've got good user growth, we're predicting more, but we really need to prioritize reliability of site, because if we start doing this, we're going to crack. I was like, okay, great. So what's your focus for your team in Q1? And he ran UX design. And so for folks that are in that space, that would likely mean that you've got UXers and designers who work within the engineering teams, to help them deliver on the outcome. And he was like, well, I'm going to I really need that. For me, it's important that the site is fun. And so I'm prioritizing in this offsite that we're organizing to make sure that my team really focus on fun for the user. And I made this face.
Yeah. What could possibly be wrong with fun, Gillian?
And we all like some fun. But to go forth, like, and I get where he's coming from. I can empathize. Yes, I knew the site. It definitely needed to work on some fun elements. But if the whole company is working on reliability, and your team, which is, maybe 10% of the organization, is working on fun, you are setting your team up for failure. And to your point, like organizational chaos. And it's just it doesn't put them in a good light, because then the rest of the engineers or builders are like, well, I don't really know what they're doing, but they're distracting. I don't care about that. I've been told to focus on something else. So yeah. And it makes me think of something my husband tells me all the time, because I'm impatient. Delayed is not denied. So, just because, yes, fun is important for the user experience, but maybe in this quarter, get your team to build credibility, help the rest of the organization, the engineers, sales, to focus on reliability. And then you build that credibility to, maybe pull in fun a bit later. Yeah. But
I should say that there's basically there is a procedural way to do that right. It's like, for instance, if if you believe that fun is really important for the user and you believe that you have the evidence or the data or whatever it is to back that up, then you can sell that into your leadership as a priority and they can ratify it so that you can be working in conjunction with your peers to deliver on that as a priority from some future quarter, or maybe even sooner if you can make a very persuasive argument very soon. But there's a way, basically, it's like if you really, truly believe that that's super duper important, then it should be important for everyone and everything.
Yes. But don't push your ideas through your team.
Exactly. And not in such a way which sort of blinkers you to the broader momentum of the organization, of which you are either pulling with or against.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. One thing I wanted to make sure we covered, and we're kind of leading into this already, is, you've had extensive background with wearing lots of different hats.
Yeah, a lot of hats.
Love hats.
Yeah, figuratively and literally.
Yeah. Many berets were worn in this career.
Much to my wife's dismay.
But as you've worn lots of different hats, the one thread of that's I think has come across all of them is the change bit.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that's always been something that motivated me. It was change for good, positive change.
And it feels like, which is very good for Overtime Leader, everyone is realizing it's not just scale-ups, but also enterprise. It's time for change. We need to rethink how we're doing things. We need to stay competitive. And basically everyone we're working with now is leading change in one form or another. And I love that. It's my favorite place to be. However, it takes technique, it takes strategy, it takes patience and consistency. I wanted to, in the time that we have, download your best bits of wisdom, because it's not just changing an organization means bringing a lot of people with you. And we all know that not everyone loves change. It's emotive. Even as we said, it's hard to even let go of our own ideas that don't even align to strategy. So how do you bring people with you when designing or leading organizational change?
The question is basically, as I understand it, how do you convince people of things? How do you convince people of that change is necessary and that they should be a part of it? This is a really interesting question. I think about this a lot. I would say that it sort of breaks into, there's kind of three ways of answering this. There's kind of how you win, how you succeed in delivering on your objective of changing people's minds. Then there's the second one would be how you do it in a way which is good for culture, for the organization, and preserves your interrelationships with others. And then the third one would be, how do you help make it a reality? So how do you operationalize it in lockstep with the person that you're speaking with? So I'll go through these as quick as I can in order. So how do you deliver on your objective of getting these people to embrace change? There is a way that basically you win, like every time, just about, which is that you make sure that your change initiative is strategically aligned with the best interests of the organization and aligned with the vision of its leadership. So if you are going to be walking into a room and you need to convince somebody to get him on board with this change, best case scenario, the leader of the organization or someone in leadership above this person, for instance, their boss or their boss's boss, already knows about and endorses this sort of strategic shift or initiative or whatever it's going to be, because they're close enough to the top table of the business to know that it is a necessary change in direction. If you're walking in and you've already done your due diligence in this regard, like from a purely Machiavellian political standpoint, if they disagree with you, they're not disagreeing with you. They're disagreeing with their boss, or worse, their boss's boss, right? It's not a great situation to be in. If you take all the diplomatic Machiavellian stuff out of this advice still holds true, right? Because you can walk into that negotiation confident that you are advocating for the best outcomes for the business, as is defined by the people who are in charge, the decision makers. So to take the decision makers out of it, you're representing the best interest of the business. They might be too in their own way, but maybe not in such a way which is mainlining the business needs, right? So that's the first thing. Is just like make sure that you're representing, if you can, high level strategy and high level decision makers. Ideally, people above them within their own chain of command, because then it's very difficult for them to kind of to totally ignore the conversation that they're having with you.
And then it's it's not about you, Laurence,
No,
coming in and, moving people around. It's like, I'm just a vehicle.
I'm an agent. I'm an agent of this change, which is being commissioned by the powers that be, who have your best interest at heart.
Yeah.
I mean, and that kind of takes me to the second thing, right? Which is like, so you can win these conversations if you've done it in the right way and you're representing change, which is ratified at a high level of strategy or leadership. But you really should ideally do it in such a way which is good for culture, preserves relationships. So, for instance, when you're in that room, you need to be kind, you need to listen, you need to acknowledge the other person and their needs and their points of view. You need to acknowledge that anything that they experience as change, they may very likely experience as a loss. So I remember very clearly the first time I ever heard the phrase, people experience all change as loss. Any change is experienced as loss by people. There's some variation of that. It was said by Leanna Chang, fantastic facilitator, who did some work with a company that I was working with at the time. And I thought about that so much that, even if it's a change for the better, and even if people can acknowledge that in the moment, it's still going to be something that they're going to have to let go of, something that they know and that they're comfortable with. And there will be a process of grief and mourning associated with that departure of the known, from the known, right? And then the last thing is kind of obvious, which is, you need to make sure that you're engaging with this person in such a way that they don't feel like this change is like something which is happening to them, but is sort of like that they are part of, right? And I think, it's really important to frame it in a way that shows that you're not just here because of your little kingdom and its little parochial needs, but that you're here doing your best to advocate not just for the best interests of the company, but for their own best interests, which is it's going to be true if you've done that Machiavellian thing in the first layer, right? So we've gone through like the how do you win, and we've gone through like how do you engage on a human level. And the third thing is like, well, how do you actually, make this meaningful and help them to do it? Because it's like even if you have like a really good conversation where, say, you're having a chat with this person and they're agreed with the theory of this is a good idea, what you don't want is for them to leave the room and be like, but what am I going to do with that information? How am I actually going to do this? Like, you should be offering your services if you have the capacity or the bandwidth, and if not, you should be giving them resources if possible to enable them to deliver on this vision. So are there tools that you can give them to help them along the way? If they expect that they're going to have difficulty negotiating with their own teams or their own leadership, exactly how this works through, you can say, I can offer myself, I can meet with your boss and talk through any concerns they might have. If we can't negotiate a solution between us, it's like we can always escalate to a parallel leadership within our two divisions or whatever it is, whatever organizational kind of parallel you might have, or whatever organizational analog your business might have.
And I think, also creating community. Like, they're not the only ones that will be going through this change, and just bringing people together to talk about what's working, but also what's, what they're worried about. It's very powerful. So yeah, the Machiavellian bit, which let's not pretend that doesn't exist.
Speaking for the best interest of the company and the leadership of the business. Yeah.
Not for your kingdom, but for
the betterment of all.
Betterment of all. Number 2 is meet them as a human, hear them, connect with them. And number 3, and I think a lot of people stop at number 2. You have a conversation like, well, good for others, but I have nothing to do with this. But actually really making sure that they come with you. And one of the most referenced frameworks, I've used it Overtime Leader, which you have seen, is the Knopfler Conditions for Change grid. If you haven't seen this before, I will link it. But essentially it has, I think, 5 core elements for good change, from vision, resources, skills, action plan. there's something else I'm forgetting. But if you have all of those 5 things, especially when you communicate from big to small, you will initiate change. If you miss one, you might get a false start. You miss another one, you get confusion. And I think we've all been in organizations where they're missing one, maybe two, maybe more. But it's I use it even, tiny things. I just look at those 5 and go, okay, when I'm doing my comms, have I brought that all into the picture? And it is fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to say that that's like one of my favorite schematics on Earth. I think that there's so much wisdom packed into that tiny chart. And like so much, like it really validates what it is. Like when you hear like a poet or a songwriter puts into words something that you've always felt and known to be true, but you've never quite managed to articulate to yourself. It's like when I saw that chart, it was almost like a moment like that for me. I was like, this is what I've been experiencing. It's like, it's really, it's really very useful. I double down on how useful it is. Plus
very
one.
Saul Bass experience.
Yeah, very Saul.
All right. As we wind down this episode, and thank you so much for sharing all this insight, Laurence. There's a little bit of your bio you left out. I don't think a lot of people know you, which is you were born into a sailing family.
Yes, I was. That's true. My father in particular is sort of a very kind of eccentric and strong-willed sailorman, and I grew up in an environment of sailing, I suppose, and boats, and the world of boats, and the world of repairs, when inevitably our boats would find a rock or two in some far-flung locale.
Now, I am no sailor. I love swimming, but I'm a land person. I did sailing for one summer. It was like, I remember there's a moment my dad picked me up and I said, why is mom making me do this? I hated it. But I respect it, especially all the knots and dock spires. That's what I remember. But as I was thinking about this conversation and thinking about change and, why were you attracted to it? Why are you so good at it? I did wonder if there was a connection or a link between growing up on the water and corporate transformation and wearing lots of different hats.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's like, I should say that it's been a long time since I've been a proper sailor, decades. But it did happen at such a time that it was very formative. And there's definitely things that I learned on the sea. And I think probably more applicably, like in boat yards, that sort of in my adult life has matured into concepts that have served me in good stead professionally. The one that springs to mind is, I felt like my entire childhood was spent in boat yards repairing wrecked sailboats. And when you're in a boat yard and you don't have the money to pay other people to do all the stuff, you end up having to do all sorts of things that you don't really know how to do. It's just at the very beginning, it's like you might go in and know a little bit of woodworking, but then you have to do a plumbing job and you have to figure it out. And there's some electrics and you kind of figure it out. And you kind of go from thing to thing that you don't really know how to do, but then you do it and it's pretty much fine, or at least it always was for us. I'm not advocating the practice of, going into electrical kind of boxes without a qualified license or anything like that. But back in the 80s, you could get away with a lot. and we were just kind of figuring it out as we went and fixing everything as we went. And I think there were probably a lot of times where I would sort of get in, even as a young kid, I'd be like, I don't really know how to do that. But then you had kind of ancillary experiences working with your hands, and then you get into it. And then by the time you're done, you pretty much know how to do it. And I think that in my sort of professional roles, something that I took away from that was not being afraid of the things I don't know or know how to do. There being a certain degree of confidence that the only thing between me and that is a breadth of experience, which I can overcome simply by doing. And, it's like the number of times where I was really committed to accomplishing a thing. And someone at some point would say, we can't do that. It's impossible. And then they would sort of blind me with science. They would say, for this highly technical reason within the infrastructure of this, that, the other, whether it be legal or play out or UX&D or whatever. And what I found was, rather than be intimidated by this, it's a hard no for highly technical reasons, which I'll never understand. You sit down and you do your homework and you learn the lingo, you spend some time with that person. Almost always, there is a way to do the thing. Almost always. It might not take the exact shape or form that you'd initially envisioned, but the substance of it is almost always achievable. And I'll tell you an interesting thing. The way that the answer, what the solution is listening to people, usually listening to people and understanding them and helping them solve a problem for you in so many words. And I just think, I remember going back to the boatyard, I have this eternal vision, an amalgam memory of my dad huddled over some pile of broken wood or fiberglass or an old brass Gardner engine. So he'd be saying, where there's a will, there's a way, you know? And I think it's the case. If you truly want and believe in a thing and you feel like you have strategic validation behind it, you can find a way most of the time, almost all the time. I think everything I've ever really cared about, we've managed to accomplish in one form or another, even when people said it couldn't be done. But it's like, but you just need to, I suppose you just need to find that way and not be afraid of the things that would put you off, you know? I'm sure there are limits to this philosophy, but in my own personal experience, I'm struggling to remember a time when I was truly deterred from something that I passionately believed could and should happen.
And worth exploring.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
and again, it's like, and it's not you. It's not about you and what you're doing. It's about you listening to others and understanding their worlds, their priorities, their pressures, their capabilities, their constraints, and using that as the framework to solve the problem, as opposed to your third person perspective, which is wholly removed from their realm or their range of experience.
Well, pretty powerful stuff, Lauren.
Oh, well, yeah. That's what I trade in.
I love that. I mean, I could go on for ages and maybe we do a part 2, but I think this is more than enough food for thought for folks to digest on as they think about the year ahead and the role they want to play and the changes they want to make. And, it's not going to be easy. It requires patience. But I think the biggest takeaway from here, it requires listening to others and opening up and bringing people with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Doing the impossible is not done solo.
Yeah, especially not in big organizations.
No. Well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And shout out to Liana Chang, who you already referenced, with the glue that connected us.
She was indeed.
Very thankful for that.
She introduced us and an absolute legend.
Yes. Well, on that note, Liana, if you're listening, thank you. And for everyone else, thanks for listening all the way to the end. And a big thank you to Laurence for, like I said, sharing all that wisdom, food for thought, and a lot of practical tips to start the year off with.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
What a great episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation I had with Laurence. I know I definitely did. I feel like there's for sure a part 2. So if there's anything that you didn't hear enough of, let me know and we'll make sure Laurence comes back on as a guest. We can deep dive into some of the other topics that we didn't really get space to talk about. One of the things that I loved was his quote from Saul Bass around strategies making thinking visible. I think that, the simplified way, it's simple, but it speaks volumes to actually what we're doing and what we need to do. And yes, we can do lots of thinking and research and planning, but if we don't make it easy for people to understand it, great ideas kind of don't get past go. Speaking of which, I will share the Conditions for Change framework, Knopfler's fantastic model that I have referenced millions of times over. We talked about this in the episode, so make sure to take a look at that in comments. And as always, if this was something you were interested in, please reach out and talk. Maybe we can help you with your organizational transformation and leadership alignment. Or if you want something more accessible, my online leadership program is always available, where we cover everything from your leadership style, how to build your team, how to drive performance, and most importantly, how to drive change using that strategic direction as that amazing unifier to bring everyone together. If you like this, please subscribe, comment, engage. I'd love to hear what you're thinking and what you're loving about this podcast. That's it for now. See you in a month. I'm Gillian Davis.